The mirror in the master bathroom had a crack in the corner, thin as a hair, and Amara Whitfield had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing anything you look at every single day. She noticed it that morning, though. She noticed everything that morning, because it was the last morning she would stand in that bathroom as Kendrick Whitfield's wife. She just didn't know it yet. "You're not even going to wear makeup?" Kendrick asked from the doorway. He had his tie half knotted, his jaw working the way it did when he was already annoyed and looking for a reason to confirm it. "It's a work breakfast, not a gala," Imara said. "It's with my partners." He said "my," the way he always said it lately, like the firm had swallowed the word "our" whole and never given it back. "Priscilla's going to be there. You remember how she looks." Imara knew exactly how Priscilla looked. Blown-out hair, filler in her cheeks, a wardrobe budget larger than Imara's entire freelance graphic design income. She also knew that comparing his wife to his junior partner's wife over breakfast eggs was not a normal thing for a husband to do, but she had stopped keeping a list of what was normal a long time ago. "I'll put on lipstick," she said, and that was the end of it. Or she thought it was. By the time they sat down at the restaurant, white tablecloths, a view of the river, a waiter who called Kendrick Mr. Whitfield, like they were old friends, Imara had already caught him glancing at her twice, with something that wasn't quite embarrassment. It was closer to inventory, like he was checking a box against a list only he could see. 3 weeks later, he left. He didn't scream it. Kendrick never screamed. He said it over a glass of wine he didn't finish, in the kitchen, with the recessed lighting turned low the way she liked it, which she would later think was almost funny, that he broke her heart under lighting she'd chosen to be gentle. "I need someone who matches where I'm going," he said. "You've let yourself go, Imara. I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm being honest. A man in my position needs a wife who looks like success." She didn't cry in front of him. That was the one thing she gave herself credit for. Later, in the quiet months that came after, she said, "Okay," and she meant it the way you mean it, when the floor has already given out beneath you and there's nothing left to do but fall. The divorce took 4 months. The apartment took 2 more weeks to pack up, because it turned out 11 years of marriage produced more boxes than either of them expected. Her sister Cecilia came to help and didn't say much, which was its own kind of mercy, until the last box was taped shut and she finally asked, "What are you going to do now?" Imara looked around the empty apartment, her half of it, anyway, the half that had once had her drawings taped to the fridge and now had nothing but sun-faded rectangles where the tape used to be. "I don't know," she said. Something. What she didn't say, because she didn't fully believe it yet herself, was that somewhere underneath the humiliation, a small, stubborn ember had started to glow. Not revenge. She wasn't interested in revenge. Not really. Not the loud kind people wrote about. It was something quieter. It was the decision, made at 2 in the morning with a box of unopened dishes at her feet, that she was done asking anyone whether she was enough. She moved to a smaller place, near the edge of the city, above a laundromat that hummed through the floorboards at night. She kept freelancing, logos, brand decks, the occasional magazine layout for clients who paid slow and complained fast. It wasn't glamorous. It paid the bills most months. It was during one of those jobs, 6 weeks after the move, that everything changed, though it didn't look like change. It looked like Tuesday, a boutique fashion label, small, scrappy, run by a woman named Abena Osei, who'd built the whole thing out of a rented studio, and sheer nerve, needed someone to shoot a lookbook on short notice. Their model had backed out. Abena was frantic, calling everyone she knew, and Imara, who was there dropping off the final brand deck, was standing in the studio in a plain white shirt when Abena looked at her the way you look at something you weren't expecting to find. "Can you just stand there a second?" Abena said. "I'm not a model." "I didn't ask if you were a model. I asked you to stand there." Imara stood there. The photographer, a quiet young man named Desmond, who barely spoke except through his camera, lifted his lens and took one frame. Just one. Then he lowered it and looked at Abena, and something passed between them that Amara didn't understand yet. "Do it for real," Abina said. "Please, I'll pay you double your design rate." Amara almost said no. She thought about Kendrick's voice, "You've let yourself go," and how it had lived in her head for months, like a tenant who wouldn't pay rent and wouldn't leave either. And then, for reasons she couldn't fully name, she thought, "Let's see." "Fine," she said. "One shoot." She did not know, standing under those studio lights in a borrowed dress that fit her like it had been made for her, that this was the moment everything turned. She only knew that for the first time in almost a year, she felt something other than small. The lookbook photos went up on Abina's small but devoted social media following on a Thursday night. By Friday morning, one image, Amara turned 3/4 away from the camera, chin lifted, eyes steady and unbothered, had been reposted by a stylist with 60,000 followers, captioned simply, "Who is this?" Amara found out about it from Cecilia, who called her at 7 in the morning, breathless. "Have you looked at your phone?" "I'm asleep, Cecilia." "Look at your phone." She looked at her phone. Then she sat up in bed and read the caption 4 times, and then she read the comments, which were not the kind of comments she was used to receiving about herself. Bone structure like that should be illegal. Who is her agent? She's not even trying and she's eating everyone alive. She didn't cry. She laughed, actually, a short, disbelieving laugh that startled her cat off the bed. By that afternoon, Abina had 3 separate agencies asking for her contact information. By the following week, Amara had turned down 2 and was sitting across from a woman named Solange Marchetti, who ran a boutique modeling agency known for finding faces nobody else was looking for and turning them into the faces everybody wanted. "I'm 34, Amara said, the first thing out of her mouth, like a confession. "I have no experience. I have a whole design career." Solange didn't blink. "You have something most 20-year-olds spend their whole careers trying to fake," she said. "You have a face that's lived a life, that reads as real, and real is the one thing this industry keeps running out of." She slid a contract across the table. "I'm not promising you Vogue. I'm promising you work, if you want it, and I think you might actually be good at this." Amara looked at the contract for a long time. She thought about the mirror with the crack in the corner. She thought about a man checking her against a list. She signed it. The next 18 months blurred in a way Amara would later struggle to fully describe, even to her sister, even to herself. There were early mornings in cold studios and long days of standing still in uncomfortable shoes. There were castings, where she was told no more times than she was told yes. There was a stretch of 3 months where nothing happened at all, and she sat in her apartment above the laundromat and wondered if she'd imagined the whole thing, if it had been a fluke, a single good photograph mistaken for a career. Solange never let her fully spiral. "This industry runs on patience and spite," she told Amara once, over coffee that had gone cold between them. "Patience for the wait, spite for everyone who told you no. Use both." Amara started to notice something happening in herself that had nothing to do with the camera. It wasn't that she'd become prettier. She resisted that framing, even in her own head, because it felt like agreeing with Kendrick's math, and she refused to give him that. It was that she'd stopped shrinking. She stood differently. She answered questions in interviews and castings without the small apologetic laugh she used to attach to the end of every sentence, the one that used to say sorry for taking up this much space. The first real break came from a campaign nobody expected, a heritage fashion house, looking to modernize, searching for faces that felt lived in rather than manufactured. Amara's test shots landed on the creative director's desk on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, she had a contract for a global campaign. She called her sister first. Then she sat alone in her apartment for a long while, not celebrating exactly, just sitting with it, letting it settle into her, the way good news sometimes needs time to feel true. She thought, briefly, of calling Kendrick. She didn't. There was nothing to say to him yet. Not yet. That would come later. That would come on its own time, in its own way. And when it did, she wouldn't have to say a single word. The campaign shoot took place over 3 days in a converted warehouse with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in gray winter light, the kind photographers loved because it didn't lie about anything. Aymara stood in front of the lens in a structured black coat that cost more than her old apartment's monthly rent, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely like herself. Desmond, the same quiet photographer from Abina's studio, who'd been brought on because Aymara had asked for him specifically, lowered his camera between takes and studied the monitor. "You know what's strange?" he said, not looking up. "Most people, the camera has to find something in them. You, it's like the camera's just getting out of the way." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, which by now she'd learned was often the better answer. The campaign released in early spring, splashed across billboards in 3 cities, and the inside covers of magazines Aymara used to flip past in waiting rooms, without a second thought. Cecilia sent her a photo of a bus stop ad near their old childhood neighborhood. Aymara's face 40 feet wide, expression unreadable, eyes doing all the work. "Mama would have lost her whole mind," Cecilia wrote. Aymara smiled at that, alone in her hotel room in another city she'd flown to for another shoot, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for 2 years. She still hadn't heard from Kendrick. She told herself she didn't expect to. She told herself some nights that she didn't want to. Both of those things were mostly true. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't know until much later, was that Kendrick had, in fact, seen the bus stop ad. He'd been in a car with Priscilla, the marriage to her now 11 months old, and already fraying at edges he refused to examine too closely, when the ad passed the window, and he did a double take so visible that Priscilla asked what was wrong. "Nothing," he said. "Thought I saw someone I knew." He did not tell her it was his ex-wife. He did not tell her, 3 weeks later, when the same face appeared on a magazine cover at the grocery store checkout, that his hands had gone briefly cold around the shopping basket. He told himself it was a coincidence, a woman who simply resembled Aymara, because the alternative required him to sit with a version of events he wasn't ready to sit with. He was good at that, not sitting with things. It was, if he'd been honest with anyone, including himself, the exact skill that had made the marriage collapse in the first place. The constant forward motion, the refusal to look directly at anything uncomfortable for longer than it took to walk past it. Back in Aymara's world, momentum kept building in a way that felt less like luck and more like something finally correcting itself. A director working on a documentary about women reinventing themselves after major life ruptures reached out to Solange's agency, hoping to feature Aymara. Aymara said yes before she'd fully thought it through, and then spent a week regretting the impulse, because it meant talking, really talking, on camera, to strangers, about the year that had broken her. The interview took place in her apartment, the one above the laundromat, because she'd refused to do it anywhere more polished. She wanted, she told the director, for it to look like where she'd actually rebuilt herself. Not a studio pretending to be real. "Can you tell me about the moment it changed?" the director asked, camera rolling, lighting soft and unobtrusive. Aymara sat with the question longer than was probably good for the footage. "I don't think there was one moment," she said finally. "I think I keep waiting to be able to point at a single day and say, that's when I became someone else. But that's not how it happened. It was smaller than that. It was deciding, over and over, on ordinary days, that I wasn't going to agree with the worst thing anyone ever said about me." "Your ex-husband told you that you'd let yourself go," the director said gently. "Do you think about that?" Aymara's jaw tightened, just slightly, the only visible sign of the old wound underneath. "I used to think about it every day," she said. "Now I think about it maybe once a month, and when I do, I mostly just feel sorry for him, because he had something in front of him the whole time, and he decided it wasn't enough before he ever bothered to actually look at it." She didn't say his name. She never said his name. In any interview, in any conversation with press. Not out of protection for him. She felt none. but because she'd learned that his name, spoken aloud in that context, gave him a kind of relevance in her story that he no longer deserved to have. He was a chapter, not the author. The documentary aired 8 months later, to modest but attentive viewership, and clips of that particular answer circulated online for a week, captioned with variations of the same sentiment. She really said, "I feel sorry for him," and moved on with her whole life. If there was a quiet stretch in Amara's rise, it came that summer, during a month-long break Solange insisted on. "You'll burn out if you don't stop," Solange told her, not unkindly. "Go somewhere. Do nothing. Let your face rest, and let the rest of you rest too." Amara went to the coast, to a small rented house with peeling blue shutters and a porch that faced the water. She spent the days doing almost nothing, reading, walking the shoreline at low tide, cooking meals for one, and eating them slowly, instead of standing over the sink the way she used to, when she was too tired to sit down. It was there, on a gray afternoon with rain threatening but never quite arriving, that Cecilia called with news that made Amara go very still. "Vogue wants you," Cecilia said. "Not a feature. Not an inside spread. The cover, Amara. They want the cover." Amara sat down on the porch step, phone pressed to her ear, and looked out at the water for a long moment before she trusted her voice enough to respond. "Say that again," she said, slowly. Cecilia said it again, slowly, and Amara laughed, really laughed, the kind that comes up from somewhere old and unguarded. And for a moment, she wasn't a campaign face, or a documentary subject, or a former wife who'd been told she wasn't enough. She was just a woman on a porch by the water, finding out that the life she'd quietly built out of the wreckage of the old one had just handed her something she never would have dared to ask for out loud. She thought, briefly, of the crack in that old bathroom mirror. She wondered if it was still there. She realized she didn't care either way. The Vogue shoot took place over 2 days in early autumn, and it was unlike anything Amara had done before, not because the process was so different, but because of how it felt to walk into that building, past walls lined with covers going back decades, faces that had defined entire eras, and know that hers would soon be among them. The creative team wanted something specific, not glamour for its own sake, but strength. The brief, which Solange read to her over the phone the week before, used a phrase that stuck with Amara long after. "A woman who has already survived the worst thing that could be said about her." "They researched you," Solange said. "The team knows the story. Not the details, but the shape of it. They want that in the images. Not sadness. Not a comeback narrative dressed up as tragedy. Just quiet, earned power." Amara stood in front of the camera that day and thought about 11 years of a marriage that had slowly convinced her she was something to be managed rather than someone to be loved. She thought about a kitchen with dim, recessed lighting and a voice telling her she'd let herself go. And she let all of it show up in her eyes, not as pain exactly, but as distance. The particular, hard-won distance of someone who has walked far enough away from a wound that she can finally look back at it without flinching. The photographer captured it in the second hour. Everyone in the room felt it happen, the way you feel a room shift when something real occurs inside it. Nobody said much. Desmond, who'd been invited to shadow the shoot as a mentee, later told Amara it was the stillest he'd ever seen a room of professionals go quiet. "That's the cover," the creative director said, looking at the monitor. Nobody argued. The issue hit newsstands on a Tuesday in November, cold and overcast, the kind of gray morning that made most people want to stay in bed. Amara was in her apartment. She'd kept the one above the laundromat, even now, because something in her refused to let go of the place where she'd rebuilt herself, drinking coffee and trying not to check her phone every 4 minutes. She failed at that almost immediately. By 9 in the morning, the image was everywhere, not just on newsstands, but reposted, shared, dissected in captions that ranged from admiring to reverent. This is what resilience looks like. She didn't need anyone's permission to become this. Someone had dug up an old quote from the documentary, "I feel sorry for him," and paired it with the cover image, and that pairing alone had been shared thousands of times by mid-afternoon. Imara sat with her coffee going cold and watched her old life and her new one collide in real time on a screen, and felt, strangely, calm, not triumphant, not vindicated in the loud way she might have expected 2 years earlier, in the raw first weeks after the divorce, when she used to lie awake constructing bitter, satisfying scenarios of Kendrick finding out exactly what he'd thrown away. The real version of that moment, when it came, was quieter than anything she could have imagined. Kendrick was at the grocery store, the same one, the same checkout line, an odd symmetry he wouldn't notice until much later, picking up something for dinner because Priscilla was working late, and he'd decided, that week, to try being the kind of husband who made an effort. The magazine rack was at eye level, the way it always was, a wall of familiar celebrity faces he usually scrolled past without a second glance. He saw the cover before he understood what he was looking at. It took a full 3 seconds, long enough for the woman behind him in line to notice him staring and follow his gaze, curious what had stopped him cold, for the picture to resolve into a name his brain had refused to attach to a face that composed, that steady, that undeniably arrived. Imara. He picked up the magazine with hands that weren't entirely steady. He read the cover line beneath her name, a single phrase about reinvention, about survival, about a woman who'd rebuilt her life on her own terms, and felt something cold drop through his chest that he didn't have a ready word for. It wasn't quite regret. It was closer to the specific vertigo of realizing you'd been wrong about something so completely, so publicly, that the wrongness itself had become a kind of permanent record. He bought the magazine. He didn't know why exactly, except that some part of him needed to hold physical proof that this was real, and not some strange resemblance, some trick of studio lighting. He read the profile inside, standing in the parking lot, ignoring the cold, ignoring the bag of groceries slowly losing its chill in the trunk. The article didn't mention him by name. Imara had made sure of that. In every interview, every profile, every carefully worded answer. But there was a paragraph, near the end, that he read 4 times. There was a version of me, the profile quoted her as saying, who believed that a man's opinion of my face was the final word on my worth. I don't know exactly when I stopped believing that. I just know that somewhere in the space where his voice used to be the loudest thing in my head, I finally heard my own. He stood in that parking lot for a long time. The message came 3 days later. Imara almost didn't open it. She'd blocked Kendrick's number over a year earlier, in one of the small acts of self-preservation that had added up, over time, into something larger, but he'd found a way through a mutual contact, a brief, careful note passed along with an apology for the intrusion. I saw the cover, the message read. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted to say, I was wrong, about all of it. I hope you know that. Imara read it twice, sitting on her porch. She'd bought the coastal house eventually, the one with the peeling blue shutters, because some part of her had never fully left that gray afternoon by the water. She thought about all the versions of herself who might have responded to this message. The version from 2 years ago, who would have cried reading it, who might have felt some flicker of vindication, or even, God help her, hope. The version from 1 year ago, who might have written back something sharp, something designed to make him feel every bit as small as he'd once made her feel. She was neither of those versions anymore. She typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Finally, she wrote something short, something that cost her nothing, and gave him nothing either, because that felt like the truest reflection of where she'd actually landed. Thank you for saying that. I hope you're doing well. She sent it, set the phone face down on the porch railing, and went back to watching the water, the way she'd learned to do in the months after everything fell apart, not waiting for anything, not performing peace for anyone's benefit, just genuinely, quietly at rest, inside a life she'd built with her own 2 hands, out of nothing but stubbornness and time. Solange called that evening with news of another booking, a spring campaign, bigger than anything before it. Imara listened, said yes, and then sat on the porch a while longer after the call ended, the sky going that particular shade of violet gray it turned right before full dark. She thought about the mirror with the crack in the corner, in an apartment she no longer lived in a marriage that had ended nearly 3 years ago now. She thought about how long she'd spent believing that crack was a flaw in her, rather than simply a flaw in a piece of glass that had nothing to do with her worth at all. There is a kind of ending that arrives with fireworks, and there is a kind that arrives quietly, in the ordinary hush of an evening on a porch, and Imara had come, over time, to prefer the second kind. Not because the pain hadn't been real. It had been real, and it had been long, and there were still nights when an old ache surfaced without warning, uninvited. But because true peace, she'd learned, doesn't announce itself. It simply moves in, unhurried, and stays. She thought of the women who might one day read her story, the ones sitting in some version of that kitchen with dim lighting, hearing some version of those words, believing, for a while, that someone else's verdict on their face, or their worth, was the final word on either. She wanted them to know what had taken her the better part of 2 years to understand, that being told you are not enough by someone who never really looked at you is not a diagnosis. It is only ever an opinion, spoken by someone whose vision was too small to hold the whole of you. The real work, she had come to believe, was never about becoming someone new enough to earn back a love that had been withdrawn. It was about becoming someone steady enough that you never needed that love to know your own worth in the first place. Imara picked her phone back up once more before she went inside, not to check for another message, but to look, one more time, at the photograph everyone was talking about. Her own face, chin lifted, eyes doing all the work, entirely her own. She smiled, set the phone down for good, and went inside to start dinner, in a house with a view of the water, in a life that belonged, finally and completely, to no one but her.